Okay.
Is you ready?
I have to introduce. It's November 14th, 9:30 in the morning, and I don't know your name because you took your card off.
Vera Levine.
Vera Levine, and this is G'Nifer Fuschel doing the interview. You can start, with your name, where you're from, your parents' name, your original name, and then start from there.
All right, my name is Vera Levine. I came from Berlin. I was an only child. I was 12 and a half years when I left Germany. My father had a business. My mother was at home. She was a first-class dressmaker, but she had retired. She just worked for the family. I was very overprotected. I came from kind of family that during the flu season, you didn't use public transportation. You didn't go to theater or opera. Very, very overprotected. We lived in a suburb of Berlin. My mother, incidentally, was not Jewish. My mother converted when she married my father. At my 6th birthday party, my best friend didn't show up. Now, this was 1933. And we waited and waited, and then one of the other mothers approached my mother and said, Mrs. Friedland, I don't think Mrs. Meyer will come because you're Jewish. So at 6 years old, I think it was the first time that I heard the fact that I was Jewish. I was familiar with the candlelighting ceremony and Hanukkah, but it never was really spelled out that I was Jewish and there was another world around me that was different. It was interesting. Going to school, an elementary school in this suburb of Berlin, Pankow, I was relatively lucky because there was no overt anti-Semitism. But I do remember asking my mother for 20 pfennigs or some kind of small change. We were going to see a movie from school. And my mother, naive woman that she was, thought it would be Snow White or a children's story. Turned out it was the story of Horst Wessel, one of the founders of the Nazi Party, with very graphic details of street fighting between the young Nazi Party and the communists, and a lot of blood. And my parents were horrified afterwards when they found out about it. Anyway, I finished the 4 years of elementary school there. Then we moved, my grandfather died, and we moved into the city to my grandmother's apartment. It was a huge barn of a place. She had moved there as a bride with separate this is an apartment I'm talking about, with separate entrance for the servants. And they were supposed to have changed apartments when my grandfather became ill and died. And then, of course, it was thought that poor Omi couldn't be expected to leave her familiar apartment under the circumstances. So we moved in with her. It was right in the center of Berlin. And I started to go to Jewish school, the only Jewish secondary school in Berlin, which was good. Concentrated on Hebrew, became much more conscious of my Jewish background and history. Had a lot of friends. My close friend Jenny lived a subway ride away from us, and even then I was quite independent. I was allowed to travel around Berlin by myself. However, I had to be home at a certain time. I had to be home at the latest, I think it was 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock. And I remember coming home on the subway train, being late and sort of trying to push the train to make it go faster, because then I would be in trouble. And obviously the reason was that my parents were so very concerned. If I was 5 minutes late, they imagined, God knows what had happened to me. Kristallnacht came. I didn't know about it. I didn't know about it until the next morning, when my mother told me I couldn't go to school. Now my girlfriend Jenny's parents came originally from Poland, which meant that that night her father was rounded up and sent back to Poland. I remember telephoning her, agonizing 2 or 3 days before we could get together again. Our business was right next door with the next block from a department store, a Jewish department store. Very nice one. The damage caused there was spectacular. The revolving doors would not move because of the heaps of glass. Typewriters were thrown out of the 5th floor. Merchandise was destroyed. The streetcars could not travel by that place because of the broken glass. Turned out the store was owned by an English Jew, and they had to pay reparations for it. I remember things like that. We got kind of pleasure out of this. That is very graphic in my memory. And of course then we had no business anymore. My father was home. My father, who was a strict disciplinarian, suddenly switched roles with my mother. My mother was not a well woman. She had kidney disease from my earliest recollection and very high blood pressure with it. Nobody knows exactly which comes first. And reacted very poorly to this, obviously to the stress, everyday stress of those Hitler years. Every time the doorbell rang, she went in panic. So she was much more intolerant of me. Suddenly, roles were reverted. My father was more protective and would even suggest I should go and visit my friend to get out of the house every once in a while. My uncle, my only uncle, my father's brother, was arrested twice. Was a doctor, was accused of what they called Rassenschande, which I believe means sexual relations with non-Jewish, with Aryan patients. Was arrested twice, never sent to a concentration camp, but detained in the basement of the police station for 3 or 4 days and beaten and what have you. After the second time, he was released and was able to get to England. England had, maybe Kinder may not even be aware of it. England had made provisions for endangered adult men to be sent to England, to a camp in the south of England in Sandwich. Kitchener camp, I remember now. And my uncle was one of the fortunate ones to be sent there. His wife and my small cousin followed later on. My grandmother had an affair with a distant cousin, the love affair with a distant cousin of hers, who wanted to marry her, and she jilted him. And I guess with a broken heart, he decided to leave Germany and went to England and married there and lived in England. And during the Hitler years, of course, my family, like every other Jewish family, tried to ferret out any kind of family abroad in the hope that they could help. And she wrote to this man, Uncle James Berenson, I remember, who immediately wrote back to say that he had a daughter, Sophie, who was very much involved in finding guarantors for children and had placed several children already in England. And of course, helped me to. On New Year's Eve, 1939, we got word that there was a guarantee for me. And I was going to go to England. And I left then June 5th, 6 months later. I remember, I don't think there was any direct correspondence between the woman who gave the guarantee, and my parents. It might have been through this cousin. But I remember a letter coming to my parents wondering whether it was all right if I attended church with Miss Kingham. 12 years old, I became hysterical. As far as I was concerned, anybody that was non-Jewish was my mortal enemy. I couldn't envision living with a non-Jew. Anyway, I was well prepared for the trip emotionally. I had private English lessons 5 days a week. Don't think they did very much good, except I didn't have to do my homework and didn't have to practice the piano, and those were plus factors. I reacted to a great extent as though it was going to be an adventure. I wouldn't have to ask permission to wear, which dress to wear when I went to school. We used to wear knee-highs in the fall, and then in the winter, these horrible woolen stockings, which I hated. And all I could think of, well, I wouldn't have to, I can go through the entire winter without having to wear the stockings. I wasn't really that immature, but boy, oh boy, I guess I was immature after all. We left, saying goodbye to my maternal grandmother, who was not Jewish, was terrible. I thought then I would never see her again. She doted on me. I was the only grandchild. My mother had one sister who died in an accident as a child. She drowned. So my mother was an only child, and I was obviously then the only grandchild. We left in the morning of my departure, had a cab. I remember my dear father realizing that I left my umbrella at home and making the cab driver return. So he ran up to the apartment to get the umbrella. Of course, I left the umbrella on purpose. I didn't want to go with an umbrella. That was my father, though. I remember very few things about the trip itself. There was a young boy, probably about 5, and there was an older girl, much older than I am. She probably is 15 or 16, who was asked to take care of this little boy. And he cried and wet his pants, but we sort of took care of him. I remember the traumatic moment when the German, I guess, SS officers came by to check our papers and to check our luggage. I had a little suitcase. They had us open things and rummage through it. And the relief when we realized we crossed over the border to Holland. And the first stop, the only stop in Holland, the station where we were given fruit and cookies. I was old enough to realize I was out of Germany. The trip on the boat was very uneventful. The next morning, I remember we disembarked, and it was a nice morning. It was June 6th. A nice, warm, sunny morning, and we sat on a large meadow. I believe it was the playing field of a school, while we were waiting for the train time. And we were given a bar of Cadbury chocolate. I was in 7th heaven. Oh, was that good? We got to Victoria Station, and we're taken to a waiting room, I suppose, with chairs lined up, for us to be picked up by our guarantors or representatives from the committee. And I know there was a boy who was older, probably also 14 or so, who turned to me and said, "Why are you crying?" I said, "I'm not crying." I wasn't. But tears were streaming down my face. I guess just tension. Short trip, my name was called. I met Miss Kingham. It was a short trip to St. Albans, which was kind of a fashionable suburb of London. And my first tea party. I hated tea. Tea to me was a beverage that you were given when you were sick. And being a child, I wanted to get rid of it and then concentrate on the more interesting things. So when I was asked whether I wanted another cup of tea, I said thank you, thinking that it meant no thank you. After the 3rd cup of tea, I caught on. The woman who guaranteed for me was unmarried. She had 2 tobacconist shops in St. Albans, a very nice little house, very nice. Lived with a housekeeper. And married 2 weeks after I got there. She married a widower with a 20-year-old daughter who never knew of my existence until that first weekend when he came up. He was a head postmaster of Ipswich, that's on the east coast in East Anglia, and about 7 or 8 small towns around there. And we moved to Ipswich. The first year there, I was there 11 months and 2 weeks. They were unhappy. Now, I was not abused. It was more neglect and disinterest and total insensitivity to me. When war was declared, I thought my world had come to an end. My father had written a horrid note. Oh, of course, I should say that I had daily letters from my parents and packages at least 2 or 3 times a week. My father had written a horrid note saying that he thought there will be a way to keep in touch. He remembered the First World War where there were means of communicating through the Red Cross. But as far as I was concerned, the day war broke out, I thought my world had come to an end. My guarantor's husband, uncle, there was a conversation. She asked me, how do you feel? Who do you want to win the war? And he turned to his bride and said, Alice, how can you ask such a question? And I said, yes, how can you? Then he said, after all, she is German. And I thought, how can you ask such a question? So I say, total insensitivity. I was installed at school and I made friends, and it was a good experience for me. My guarantor, my auntie, sent me up to her room one day to get a pack of cigarettes out of a dresser. And I opened the dresser drawer, and there was a letter from the Refugee Committee. I was unhappy, and I was really a nice kid, nicely brought up, but I read the letter. And from it I gathered that they were trying to find different placement for me. And the excuse I was given was that he was a head postmaster and got early warnings of air raids and should not have an alien in the house. And I was concerned because by that time I had friends and I had established a very happy relationship at school. And through my headmistress at school, another home was found with a unmarried woman, Miss Bailey, Joan Bailey, who already had 1 kid, 2 years younger than I, Doris, and who took me. The committee paid my schooling and paid a small amount per month. And that was a lifesaver for me. This was a lady, great woman, who gave of herself unselfishly, who surrounded us with care and love with no strings attached. And you don't find that very often, even the most loving parent-child relationship. When I'm a parent, I realized this. She was really wonderful. And having Doris, this other girl there, was like having a sister for the first time in my life. The school practically adopted me. They had much more sympathy or empathy for me than for poor Doris. Doris was 2 years younger, had lost her accent and was already completely assimilated before she got into the school, whereas I was the poor little German refugee child whose parents were still in Germany. Doris had a father in London, and her mother and brother had managed to get out to Switzerland. So it was a different situation. And I made the most of it. One teacher paid for my Red Cross messages. I managed to get a tennis racket during wartime, which was almost impossible. My teacher's mother made or sent me a tennis dress without coupons. I mean, these things mean absolutely nothing here today, but at that time, they were treasures. I stayed in school. I took my matric, and my guardian, I really prefer to think of Joan Bailey as my guardian, gave me another semester in school just to give me a little breathing time between the traumatic events of this matric examination. Everybody for the last year at school, you zero in on that and try to decide what to do with my life. My headmistress tried to get funds for me to stay in school and attend college. She wrote to Lady Astor because her daughter was a school friend of Lady Astor's daughter. I was told, and I don't really blame her at all, that the Astors did not make any donations to individuals. It was just to organizations. So I decided I better find a way to become independent and make a living for myself. And I managed to get a job with the Ministry of Supply where I got training in Cambridge, very intensive lab training, and then was stationed in the north of England. And then I heard my parents had survived. Now all along, my father had given me a watch, a stainless steel watch with a very interesting clasp. Don't even remember now exactly, but everybody commented about it. And I had this childish feeling that as long as the watch still worked, my parents would be all right. But when the Red Cross messages, by the way, I don't know whether people know this, there were 25-word messages, including address and signature. So you couldn't really write very much. And any message that originated in England would go to Germany. My parents would answer on the back, and it would come back to me, and vice versa. And it would take about 4 months to make the round trip. Well, the last 6 or 8 months of the war, no messages anymore. Naturally, because of the bombing, there was no train service anymore. And I had really steeled myself to the fact that I would be an orphan at the end of the war. And I learned my parents had survived. And then I made every effort to get to Germany to try and help them. I was too young for everything. British Red Cross, UNRWA, you name it. And then through my friend, the same Jenny, who lived in England in London with her parents, and who was part of the refugee community, she had read that the American government was looking for people who could speak and read both languages fluently. And I was 2 years below their minimum age too, but they were desperate. I went for an interview. They took me. And in the end of September, a week after my 19th birthday, I went over to Germany in American uniform to work for the Civil Censorship Division. We were stationed outside Munich because of my scientific background. I had found out there was a lab. Didn't really know what kind of a lab, but a lab that didn't have to travel to Munich every day to work. The lab had a special building in the woods in Pullauf where we were stationed. So I applied for it, and of course I got the job. My husband was in charge of the lab. He was a GI. My husband.
So you married?
I met my husband, and we got married. He took his discharge overseas. This was a cryptography and secreting lab. It was interesting, photographic.
Have you seen your parents yet?
Yes. How could I forget that? I moved heaven and earth to get to Berlin. We were stationed just south of Munich. And CCD, Civil Censorship Division, had a station in Berlin. My parents contacted the American Red Cross, and I had a communication from them saying that, sent not to me, but to the CEO, saying that if I were to see my mother alive, I should come soon. And in spite of that, even, I did not manage to get papers to travel to Berlin. I was there for just a little less than a year before I managed to go to Berlin. Somebody, the GI was going to the clothing store, and I hitched a ride with him, and he had to stop off at Military Government. And I was sitting in the Jeep, and on the spur of the moment, I decided I was going to go in. I asked for a chaplain. There was no Jewish chaplain. There was a Protestant chaplain who saw me, who heard my tale of woe, couldn't understand why I couldn't have gotten TDY, and within 5 days I had TDY for 10 days, temporary duty, to assign me to Berlin. I got to Berlin, loaded down with sugar and coffee from the mess hall. The mess sergeant had given me stuff. Cigarettes, I didn't smoke. Loaded down. Didn't know how to get from the train station to my parents. Could not get transportation. Finally got transportation to our station there in Berlin, and the CO there gave me a Jeep with a young German driver. My parents lived in the Russian sector of Berlin. The kid was afraid, first of all, didn't know the Russian sector, was afraid to drive in there. How I found my way, I don't know. My parents by that time lived in the same house where I had been living until I was 6 or 7 years old, in Pankow in the suburb. What happened was the Russians set a certain date by which time Germans had to claim their property, whether that was houses, businesses, or apartments. And if they did not claim their property, then they confiscated it. And people like my parents were given to live there. So my parents at that time lived in the same house, one floor above the apartment that I grew up as I was a baby. And somehow I managed to find my way to direct that Jeep back to Pankow, which was difficult because, first of all, it was quite a while since I'd been to Berlin, but primarily streets that I was looking for didn't exist anymore. Mountains of rubble. I managed to find it. I stayed there for 10 days. I must have lost 15 pounds because I couldn't eat at my parents' house. I knew they had very little food. I couldn't swallow. And during that time, twice during those 10 days, I went to the American zone, to the PX, and ate a meal and stocked up on my cigarette and candy ration again. But it was a wonderful reunion. My maternal grandmother had survived. She was there, which I thought I would never ever see her again. My mother and father realized something strange was going on because every once in a while, more often than I realized, Bob's name would pop up, my husband-to-be. So they were not too surprised when shortly after I left, I told them we were engaged to be married. My father managed through business. He worked for the city of Berlin in the Russian sector. The Russians immediately put him in some kind of job, administrative job. He managed to get, with their help, an interzonal pass, so he came to Munich to visit. He stayed with me about a week. My mother managed to come to us after we were married. We moved to Esslingen, which was near Stuttgart, and I had my own home there. My mother was able to come also on a temporary permit. She stayed about 3 weeks with us. And then Robert's tour of duty was over, and we came back to the States. And about 18 months after that, my parents came to the States. How much time do we have? All right. I'm happily married. We will be celebrating our 47th anniversary in December. I'm very fortunate. Things were not always easy when we first came here. My mother-in-law was a very difficult person. We stayed with her for a year. We couldn't find an apartment. But things worked out. My parents came here. They had quite a number of friends here, obviously. Lots of their friends ended up in the New York area. We were much more involved with my mother-in-law, who was by then a widow and very demanding, than I was able to devote time to my parents. I think there probably was a little resentment there. Because we had to get away from New York my mother-in-law. We ended up in Dover, Delaware. My husband got a job with International Latex there. And we arrived with nothing in Dover, Delaware, and 3 years later left with 1 dog and 2 children. It was a very successful stay, to say the least. We came back to the New York area, and ended up in where I am now in New Jersey, East Brunswick. My parents decided, after my father retired, my father worked for Bond's clothing stores. I was in charge of the payroll for all the 80-something stores at that time. After my father retired, he decided he could not live on Social Security here. And they went back to Germany. And at that point, I realized that there were deep scars that I bore from the initial separation from my parents. I'd always considered myself very fortunate because my years in England were, except for the first year, my years in England were very, very pleasant. I loved England. I'm very grateful to England. England gave me back the childhood that I had lost in the last couple of years in Berlin. So I've always, and of course I never considered myself a survivor. I mean, the survivors were those who left over from the camps. But when my parents decided to go back, I found it very hard to cope. Initially, I resented the fact that they were abandoning their grandchildren. But I think, subconsciously, they were also abandoning me a second time. Now, I had always thought that my parents' decision to send me to England was the most unselfish sign of maternal love. After we were reunited, I was horrified to hear my mother say that if she had known how long the separation would have lasted, she would never have let me go. You know, this was, I realized, of course, that she suffered from losing her little girl. And unfortunately, she never found her little girl again. I wasn't that same child. And somehow, miraculously, I managed to face that fact without developing guilt feelings. My children feel a little underprivileged, I think, or shortchanged, I should say, because their mother doesn't have guilts. I don't have guilts. I have regrets about certain things. I don't have guilt feelings. And since this is the second reunion we attended, since we've attended these reunions, my husband, who would attend the workshop for spouses, found out that I'm not unique. Quite a number of us Kinder have this ability or disability, I don't know what it is, of not having guilt. I'm not a psychiatrist, I don't know why it happens, but it seems to be a fact. I realized that whatever disappointments my parents had in me, it wasn't my fault, it wasn't anything that I did or didn't do. This was a result of the Hitler times. This was a result of the separation during critical years of development. I grew up in a different country, different language, different culture, and I was not a little girl anymore. I was a young married woman when we finally were reunited. But when they did decide to go back, it was very, very hard for me to accept. My mother, now remember, my mother was not Jewish. My mother converted to Judaism. My mother told Robert, my husband, if anything happens to Papa, I will come back immediately. She only went because of my father. Their marriage was exceptionally good. They lived for each other, probably because they had been through so much during the Hitler years. They only had each other. But it was a very, very wonderful, close relationship. My father would go to work in the morning and leave love letters for my mother. You know, it was, I always said, there's my mother and my father, And then for a long time, there was nobody. And then I came. And then for a long, long, long time, nobody, and then the rest of the world. And I didn't say this with any bitterness. It was a fact. I think they were very fortunate to have that kind of relationship. But she gave in to my father about going back to Germany. And why my father wanted to go back, I have no idea. I tried to get professional help at the time to cope with it. And it was suggested that my father it was like returning to the womb. My father was going back to a time that he thought of as carefree as his childhood. My mother died in Germany. I did see her. I went once to see them, to visit them. 10 days after I left, she went to coma and she died. I think she was waiting for me to see me again. My father remarried a girlfriend of my mother's, actually. My father died then. And I've had no more contact with his second wife. I had very loving parents. Our relationship would have been very, very different if it hadn't been for the separation. But the separation was a fact. My children have very happy memories of their grandparents. I have 2 children. I am still working, although I will be retiring as of December 1. We have been offered an early retirement package. I'm looking forward to it with some apprehension because it will mean an adjustment. But I am looking forward to it. It'll give me opportunities to pursue some other interests. We live in East Brunswick. Both my children live with us. Neither one of them is married. My son is adopted. I had a great deal of difficulty conceiving and then later on carrying. So we adopted. When we went down to Dover, Delaware, we adopted. And within a very short time, I was pregnant with my daughter. Perfect pregnancy, painless delivery. I mean, just a miracle. But we are relatively old for my children. My daughter was born my 30th wedding anniversary, so we worked at it for quite a while. My husband is retired, although he does work for a friend of ours part-time, just to keep busy. My overall relationship, when I think about what happened to me, was that I think more good than bad came out of it. No question about the fact that the initial separation was a tremendous trauma. My friends consider me a survivor. Told me that years before I heard it here 3 years ago, at the first reunion that I attended, I never considered myself a survivor. But I think I am. Whether because of my early childhood or in spite of, I don't know. I hope this has been some interest for others, particularly for my family. I enjoyed doing it, and I thank you. My husband just peeked and he was
Wow, you covered practically everything.
Did I?
Oh, practically. The only thing I think you didn't touch on was Judaism.
And that is so important.
Do you want to go into that for a minute or two?
Yes, maybe you can put it in the middle though, it shouldn't really be at the end.
You can say, P.S.
All right. All right. I just realized I left out something very important. And that is Judaism. I had gone for 2 years, I had gone to a Jewish school in Berlin because of Hitler. See, everybody says there was some good in him, because of Hitler, I was much more aware of my heritage, of my religion, and of my faith. When I got to England, as I got older, I made it my business to read about it a lot. Books were not available in Germany, not to me. I don't think they were available, period. When I went to England, I had no contact with any Jewish community whatsoever. Ipswich, the small town where I was staying, had 2 other refugee girls, and they had a representative, a local representative of the Children's Refugee Committee, Mrs. Burton, who was Jewish, originally married to a Unitarian minister without a congregation, who was teaching English in a high school. She had open house for us 3 girls every Sunday, and we would congregate there. And it was through her effort, and my headmistress, that Miss Bailey was found for me as a second home. But it didn't give me any contact with my religion. I remember visiting my friend in London and seeing her mother light the Friday night candles and bursting into tears. I went there for Passover. Other than that, there was no contact at all. And yet, I didn't go to church, and everybody knew I wouldn't go to church. I don't think I would ever have considered marrying a non-Jew. Not necessarily because of my religion, but because of what it represented. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. We are Reform Jews now. My children both went to Reform temples for Hebrew school. I am 100% Jew, but I'm not an observant Jew. I do not observe the dietary laws. Both children, they may end up intermarrying, but both of them will never give up their religion. My daughter, at one time, she was close to being married, assured me that her children would be raised Jewish. Facing facts, it's difficult today to exclude the possibility of an intermarriage. And I'm a product of an intermarriage too. It worked out fine. But I am 100% Jew.